I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is episode 8 of my series on the JFK assassination. I'd like to use this particular episode to recap and summarize where we are with respect to the JFK assassination, and specifically the autopsy that the U.S. military carried out on President Kennedy's body. You'll recall the testimony of Sandra Spencer. She was the U.S. Navy petty officer who worked in the U.S. Navy's photography lab in Washington, D.C. She dealt with highly classified photographs. She worked closely with the White House, closely with President Kennedy. It would be virtually impossible to find a witness more credible and with greater integrity and veracity than Sandra Spencer. In fact, no one has ever questioned her integrity or her veracity. Well, she kept her secret for 30-some-odd years. That was because she had been sworn to secrecy and made to believe that this was highly classified. She told the Assassination Records Review Board in the 90s that she had been asked to develop a set of photographs for the autopsy. The ARRB showed her the official photographs in the record. She looked at them, examined them carefully, and said, "Those are not the photographs that I developed on the weekend of the assassination. The ones I developed, for example," she pointed out, showed a big exit-size wound in the back of President Kennedy's head, which of course would imply a shot having been fired from the front. This confirmed what the Dallas treating physicians were saying, like Dr. McClellan, Dr. Crenshaw, and the two treating physicians that gave the press conference in Dallas immediately after the president was declared dead. Now, we also have the two brain examinations. We know that there were two separate brain examinations because there were two different separate third parties at each examination. You had John Stringer, the official photographer, that said, "I was there," and then you had Colonel Fink saying, "No, I was there." And they both denied that the other was there. And that's how the Assassination Records Review Board concluded that there were two separate brain examinations, along with the testimony that indicated that one brain examination took place almost immediately after the assassination, or within 1 or 2 days. The other one took place a week or so longer after the autopsy. Now, you also had the testimony of the photographer, John T. Stringer, showing that the brain had been sectioned, sliced, to determine the trajectory. And Colonel Fink was saying, "No, the brain wasn't sectioned at the examination that I attended." And then finally, you have the weight of the brain. That it was clear that about a third or 25% of the brain was blasted away. And yet, when they weighed the brain, it weighed more than a average person's full-size brain. Virtually impossible. Now, we go from there to the fascinating story of John Knutson. Knutson was the White House photographer. He had served, presidents going all the way back to Truman and extending through the Nixon administration. I mean, this guy had worked with presidents. His job depended on his sense of integrity and trust that presidents had come to have in him. I mean, it would be impossible for somebody to keep their job through 5 presidents if the guy wasn't credible and competent. Well, Knutson comes home after 3 days away after the assassination, and he tells his family a fascinating story. He says, "I was the official photographer for the autopsy." And he says, "But I can't talk about it because I've been sworn to secrecy. It's all classified." His wife said that he treated this like the military does. That he would take it to the grave with him. One big problem. Knutson wasn't there. Everybody acknowledged that. Stringer was the official photographer for the autopsy. But clearly Knutson was photographing some procedure that he was made to believe, and that some people made him believe, was the actual autopsy. He even gave an interview to a popular photography magazine saying, "I was the photographer, and it was the hardest thing I ever did." And this was 1977, which, of course, if he wasn't telling the truth, he could have been called out on it immediately. And nobody did call him out on it immediately. So everything indicates that Knutson was telling the truth. And then he goes to and testifies before the House Select Committee. They show him the official photographs in the record, and he comes home and tells his family, "Look, there's some shenanigans going on here. those photographs that they showed me are bogus. And I want you to know that if this thing ever blows up, I had nothing to do with it. He was trying to preserve the sense of integrity that his family had the image of for him. Now, then we have all of the testimony that's intersecting showing that the body of the president was brought in early, much earlier than the 8 p.m. official time when the honor guard was carrying in the big, heavy Dallas casket. You have Commander Humes telephoning Colonel Fink at 8 p.m. saying, hey, we're getting ready to start the autopsy. We need your help. And oh, by the way, we already have x-rays of the president's head. You have Gerald Custer saying, hey, when I walked in that foyer, I knew the president's body was downstairs. And when I saw Mrs. Kennedy, and of course out there in the front was the Dallas casket. And then you've got all those enlisted men that said, we carried in the body of the president at 6:35 p.m. Then the Assassination Records Review Board determines there are two official reports that are prepared at the very time that all these things were taking place. You've got the Boyajian report, in which Marine Sergeant Boyajian said, we carried the body in this cheap military casket, certainly not the expensive casket, and certainly not wrapped in sheets like they had done in Dallas, but in a body bag. And then you've got the Gawler's Funeral Home report that says, yeah, the body was carried in a cheap style gray casket. So all of this is a recap that shows one thing. There can be absolutely no doubt, certainly no reasonable doubt, that there were shenanigans that were taking place on the evening of November 22nd. Now, how did all this get started? Well, recall that Lyndon Johnson, sets this whole process into motion there at Parkland Hospital. As soon as President Kennedy's declared dead, that team of Secret Service agents begins making preparations to get that body out of the hospital. Johnson, in the meantime, is heading to Love Field. And the team of Secret Service agents says, we're under orders. There's only one person who could have reasonably given those orders, and that's Johnson before he leaves the hospital. They brandish guns. They tell the medical examiner of Dallas County they're going to not permit him to do an autopsy there at Parkland Hospital, even though Texas law required it. I mean, have you ever seen law enforcement officers acting like that? They brandish guns, they threaten to kill anybody that gets in their way, and they force their way out of the hospital with the casket, the heavy, ornate casket. They head to Love Field. Meanwhile, Johnson is expressing some concern that this could be the first stage in a Soviet nuclear attack on the United States. But yet his actions belie that concern. He lollygags at the airport. He's there getting sworn in by a federal judge. They're having to go look for a federal judge, even though Bobby Kennedy had told him that no such swearing in was necessary. He was automatically president. He's switching luggage from Air Force 2 to Air Force 1. He's patiently waiting for the casket. He's removing seats from the back of the plane. Does this look like a man who's concerned about the possibility of a nuclear attack by the Soviet Union? I mean, it would have been one thing if Johnson had said, there's no chance of a nuclear attack here. But he expressed the concern, but then his actions confirm that he had, in reality, no concern whatsoever. That the rest of it was just play acting. Because if he really believed that there was a possibility, he would have gotten into the air immediately, playing it safe, to direct the America's counterstrike in the event that nuclear missiles were flying in, which would take just a few minutes from the Soviet Union. Everything indicates that Johnson knew that there was no possibility of such an attack, and so the question arises, how would he know that? How could he be so certain as to be lollygagging around the airport waiting for the casket to appear? So that's the recap. Something odd was going on here. Shenanigans were taking place inside the morgue at Bethesda Naval Morgue that evening of November 22nd, 1963. And as I indicated before, it all revolves around those two terms, national security.